The UK government says it has no contingency plans for another independence referendum. It comes after a BBC interview with the former First Minister, Alex Salmond, in which he said a second independence referendum was inevitable.
The vow was about home rule, devil to the max, near federalism, to quote Gordon Brown. That has not been delivered, as yet at least, in the Scotland Bill, so that's an issue. The second issue is the one that's been cast up quite a lot, and that's the European issue. If you had a situation, a circumstance, where Scotland voted to stay in the European Union in the referendum, but was dragged out in the votes of the people of England, then that would be a material change in circumstance. And the third thing emerging, of course, comes out from the budget and the welfare bill, which is, austerity. Instead of getting devo to the max, we're getting austerity to the max.
Well, a spokeswoman for the First Minister said there's no difference of opinion, and if there's to be another referendum, then it's up to the Scottish people. Well, let's speak to the Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mundell MP. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
It sounds as though you should be making contingency plans.
I think it's very disappointing that we're getting all this talk of a second referendum and the SNP Scotland office spokesman at Westminster putting down questions, asking what the UK government are doing about a second referendum, when we were told in the white paper that the referendum was a once-in-a-generation experience. We were told by the former First Minister it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. We were told by the current First Minister just before the UK general election that there wasn't going to be another referendum, and yet all this talk of a second referendum has been stirred up by SNP MPs.
And but do you accept that circumstances have changed?
I don't accept that circumstances have changed.
The political landscape's very different in Scotland from where it was a few months ago.
We had a referendum based on an agreement that both parties would respect the outcome of that referendum.
And then we had an election where the SNP swept the board.
It was a very decisive result in the referendum. We moved forward with new powers for the Scottish Parliament, as discussed during that referendum. Now it appears that that's not good enough, and that the SNP's ultimate aim is simply to have another referendum, to find an excuse to have another referendum. And I think Nicola Sturgeon needs to be much clearer than these sort of mealy-mouthed words about maybe's aye, maybe's no. Let's be clear. Is it the SNP policy to have a second referendum or not?
Aren't you playing into the SNP's hands, though, by not accepting that the situation has changed? The SNP swept the board at the most recent election, and they believe that gives them a mandate to demand perhaps a little more than was promised before that election. And you have stubbornly said no to any amendment being put down for the Scotland Bill.
That's not the position. I've said that I want to...
Well, which amendment did you accept?
I've said that we're coming forward when the bill comes back in September with amendments to the Scotland Bill, having listened to amendments that were put forward. But some amendments that were proposed were serious amendments about making the bill better, making it more clearly reflect the Smith Commission. Some amendments clearly weren't serious, like the proposals for full fiscal autonomy. That wasn't a seriously thought through amendment. Instead, it was a proposal to give Scotland a £10 billion black hole in its finances. So, of course, we're not going to accept amendments like that, but we are in a continuing dialogue about ensuring that the bill that comes forward meets the Smith Commission.
Well, give us an example of what amendment you're likely to accept that will be brought forward in September.
We're going to do this through the parliamentary process, and you'll see when the bill comes back to Parliament in September what amendments we're proposing. But it's clear from what Alex Salmond's saying, this isn't about the Smith Commission. For Alex Salmond, the Smith Commission isn't good enough. It is independence or nothing, and that's what's underlying the push for the second referendum. It doesn't matter what amendments are accepted or not to the Scotland Bill. It will never be enough. It's independence or nothing, and I think we need to be absolutely clear from the SNP that their policy is to have a second referendum and continue to push for independence.
Well, Alex Salmond's point is that the vow, as he says, that was made before the referendum by your party and by Labour and the Lib Dems as well, was about home rule. He says devo to the max, near federalism, to quote Gordon Brown. When you come back in September with the Scotland Bill, will that be a bill that gives Scotland near federalism?
That's absolute nonsense, and if actually you go through what was clearly said at the time, that wasn't what was being proposed. What was being proposed was the powers that came forward through the Smith Commission process. But for someone like Alex Salmond, those powers will never be enough. It is independence or nothing. It's about finding an excuse to have a second referendum. We are sticking to the Edinburgh Agreement that said that both governments would respect the outcome of the referendum. We're sticking with the wishes of the Scottish people who voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. And we're sticking with what Nicola Sturgeon said just a few weeks ago, that there wouldn't be another referendum.
Well, let's talk about what the Scottish people might do. If a referendum is in the SNP's manifesto at next year's Holyrood elections, and they, as they did at the Westminster election, decisively win those elections, is that a mandate for another referendum?
What I want to see is a clarity of the SNP position. At the moment, we've got Alex Salmond pushing for a second referendum. We've got Nicola Sturgeon not being very clear at all
about
if it's
in the manifesto and they win the election, is that a mandate?
Position is. Well, I want them to be absolutely clear with us what their position is on having a second referendum. They've said repeatedly that there isn't going to be a second referendum at official level. Now we see all these MPs, Alex Salmond himself, pushing for a second referendum.
Well, indeed, and you've made that point several times.
Nicola Sturgeon needs to be absolutely clear. But
can you be clear? Is it a mandate?
On that point, I don't think that it is for the SNP themselves to determine whether the people of Scotland are in favour of having another referendum. When we go into the Scottish Parliament elections next year, there's going to be a whole range of important issues which we need to be debating, like the state of our health service, where people are struggling to get a GP, the state of our police force, where we've seen serious and concerning incidents, and Scotland's declining educational standards. They'll all be issues in next year's general election. If the SNP want to make the election next year to Holyrood solely about there being a second referendum on Holyrood, on independence, they need to tell us, and they need to tell us now.
But if it's in their manifesto and they win the election, could you see a situation where Westminster says no to another referendum?
I find it very difficult to see a circumstance where the SNP will be saying to the people of Scotland that having a second referendum is more important with dealing with health, education, the police force.
Well, let's say that happens. What should Westminster do?
Taking on the new tax and welfare powers that are coming from Westminster, and a lot of speculation is that this is just simply a distraction. So
could Westminster deny a second referendum?
Rather than talking about what the Scottish Government would do with new tax powers, with new welfare powers, let's just get dragged back into the constitutional issue. So if the Scottish Government and the SNP are so concerned about the policies that the UK Government are pursuing in relation to tax and welfare, in the next Scottish Parliament, they'll have the power to do something about it. But they seem to be very, very reluctant to tell us what they want to do with those powers.
Well, perhaps you can clarify for us whether Westminster would say yes or no to another referendum if the SNP win the election next year.
Our position is quite clear. The Scottish Government said in their white paper that the referendum was a once-in-a-generation experience. The First Minister said at the time of the referendum it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
So if they renege on that, then you think Westminster should say no to another referendum?
I don't think that it's for the SNP to determine whether the people of Scotland want another.
But I'm asking you what Westminster would do.
Want another referendum. Ultimately, it will be for the people of Scotland to determine whether there is another referendum, but it won't be for the SNP to tell the people of Scotland what they're thinking on that issue.
David Mundell, Secretary of State for Scotland, thank you very much for that. We'll hear from the SNP and from Labour after 8 o'clock. It's 7:16. Let's get back to that suggestion from the former First Minister Alex Salmond that a second independence referendum was inevitable. The UK Government has said it has no contingency plans for the possibility of a vote, and an SNP statement appears to suggest another referendum is not being planned. So what's behind all of this? Well, let's discuss this with Andrew Collier, former speechwriter to Nicola Sturgeon and ex-political editor of The Sun, and political commentator David Torrance. Good morning to you both.
Morning. Morning.
Andrew, first of all, Alex Salmond, of course, has said much of what he said in his interview yesterday before. What do we make of it all?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, Gary. I think the real story out of this would be if Alex Salmond had not said that an independence referendum, frankly, is going to be inevitable. I just don't see anything terribly new in this, to be absolutely honest. I think it's very much an affirmation of Alex Salmond's pretty robust approach to constitutional matters, and it's exactly what you would expect him to say.
Is it fair to say, though, what we're seeing here is perhaps some pressure from the new MPs at Westminster, of which Alex Salmond is one, ahead of the party conference, ahead of the manifesto being drawn up for 2016, for the leadership in Edinburgh to consider this issue robustly?
I'd be very surprised if anybody could pressure Alex Salmond, to be honest. I think he's very much his own man, and he continues to be so. But as I said, he is merely saying yet again, which is the fundamental line, which is that there is going at some point to be a referendum. And as he put it himself, it's in the timing. We don't know what that timing is going to be. I certainly can't offer you any spectacular or secret insight into what the First Minister and her team are planning in terms of timing. But I would go with what she's already said, which is it will be when the people of Scotland want it. I'm sure that's the position.
Well, David, that is the position that Nicola Sturgeon has reiterated and continues to say. But of course, there is the issue of what the people of Scotland, as she would see it, want, and also what people within the party want.
Yes, and it's a very delicate balancing act, and I don't envy the First Minister in that task. I agree with Andy. I mean, Alex Salmond has been saying since 2011 that independence is inevitable, so it's not really new in that respect. More interesting, I thought, was an aside in that interview where he said that the timing was up to Nicola Sturgeon, which of course is a departure from the script. It's up to the people of Scotland, as Nicola Sturgeon and others keep saying. But of course it is up to her. It's up to her as party leader whether that goes in the manifesto. There isn't a sort of bottom-up referendum in that respect. But I think, more truthfully, they're playing it by ear. I mean, the idea, as Andy says, that within the party, there's a set timescale about a second referendum, I think is far-fetched. So many things need to change before they get anywhere near agitating for, as it might be put on Twitter, Indie Ref 2.
Well, and some MPs have been talking about this quite openly. George Caravan has said that it's an issue that cannot be ignored. The best thing would be for the leadership to come forward with some proposals on how to deal with it. He talked about the conference, the upcoming conference in the autumn, fizzing with talk of another referendum, Andrew Collier. This is a big issue within the party. Is it conceivable that a referendum would not be in the manifesto for 2016?
My own personal view, and it is absolutely a personal view, is that there will not be a timescale for the referendum in the 2016 manifesto, but there may be what I would call a paving clause, which is that something saying fundamentally actually what we already know, that there will be a referendum when the people of Scotland judge that time to be correct. That's been said time and again, and I would be surprised if there wasn't something in there along those lines, to be honest.
And David Torrance, how much of this is about the fact that the SNP are making all the political ground at the moment? Leslie Riddoch, of course, a prominent Yes supporter, talking about the lack of a focus on domestic politics in a column she's written today. Labour's internal machinations means that the focus on domestic policy isn't there, so the SNP get to frame the discussion.
Yeah, well, the SNP have more or less framed the discussion in Scottish and, to an extent, UK politics for the past 5 years, so they're keen to hold on to that. Yeah, I think that's true to an extent. I mean, there is a gap between the rhetoric and reality, between that narrative and say that the SNP assessed on the more narrow territory of their record in devolved government. So constantly wielding a second referendum is quite useful to that degree, and also useful in keeping the UK government on its toes. I've always seen this as almost taunting the UK government, taunting the Unionist parties, saying, we might have said it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, but actually, folks, this is in reserve, and we will push for another referendum if we think the time is right. But that is the crucial point, if they think the time is right.
Well, indeed, and there is a sort of quandary there, isn't there? A contradiction in some respects for the SNP, Andy Collier, that they've never been more popular. And, after almost 8 years in government, they still continue to do very well in the opinion polls. The number of people who joined the party has gone through the roof. Yet that hasn't been translated into a huge surge in support for independence as yet.
No, but I think this is a long game and has always been a long game. And you have to remember that 45-55 last September was a pretty astonishing result to many people, even on the yes side, I think. It was close, and there was certainly a feeling, and I think this is what Alex Salmond is feeling, that as the constitutional narrative plays out, particularly at Westminster, we're looking at another 5 years of Tory government, that the temperature in Scotland will continue to rise in terms of the constitutional debate, and at some point that will happen. But I think the really critical factor here is that nobody on the yes side and the SNP side is going to want a referendum until they are pretty certain that they're going to win it this time. You can't do this a third time.
OK, gentlemen, thank you both very much for your time this morning. That's Andy Collier, former speechwriter to Nicola Sturgeon, former political editor of The Sun as well, and political commentator David Torrance. And we'll hear after 8 o'clock from the SNP's Derek Mackay and also from Labour's Ian Murray. The time is 18 minutes to 8. So the question of a second independence referendum is taking centre stage this morning, following comments from the former First Minister Alex Salmond, in which he said another vote on the issue was inevitable. The Scottish Secretary has today called for clarity on the issue. David Mundell told this programme it was time for answers.
It was a very decisive result in the referendum. We moved forward with new powers for the Scottish Parliament, as discussed during that referendum. Now it appears that that's not good enough, and that the SNP's ultimate aim is simply to have another referendum, to find an excuse to have another referendum. And I think Nicola Sturgeon needs to be much clearer than these sort of mealy-mouthed words about maybe's aye, maybe's no. Let's be clear. Is it the SNP policy to have a second referendum or not?
Well, here to answer that, Derek Mackay, who is the chairman of the SNP. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Is it SNP policy?
Well, I'll let you into a big secret, Gary. The SNP still believes in independence for Scotland, and I think we always will. And our new members, of which there are now over 100,000, also believe in independence. But I'm also privileged to be a member of the Scottish Government as the Transport and Islands Minister, and I can tell you, as part of that government, there is no preparation or planning for a second referendum.
So it's not inevitable then?
Well, I think independence is actually inevitable because the direction of travel is to more powers for Scotland and ultimately independence, because that's the direction of travel. And I passionately believe in independence, but we are not planning for a second referendum.
So it's currently not SNP policy to have another referendum then?
Well, we'll have a party conference and we'll have a Scottish parliamentary election. And in that election, we'll have a manifesto that we believe will represent the people of Scotland, and that manifesto will then be presented to the people, and they can choose.
So will there be a manifesto commitment? Will there be a manifesto commitment for an independence referendum?
Well, I can't tell you what's in the manifesto because it clearly hasn't been written yet. You know, it's quite funny listening to unionist politicians talk about referendum. The only referendum that we'll face at the moment is that referendum to haul us out of Europe that there wasn't much appetite for in Scotland, with returning one Labour, one Liberal and one Conservative.
Well, it's not just unionist politicians who are talking about this. With respect, we're talking about this because Alex Salmond brought it up yesterday in an interview.
I know, but what Alex Salmond said isn't entirely new, that he believes in independence, that he thinks it's inevitable, and he would want to see another referendum at some point in time.
Well, indeed, but what people want from your party surely now is clarity as to what that time frame is.
I'll give you that clarity. We are not planning for or preparing for a second referendum, but we still believe in independence for Scotland because we think it could do so much good for the country. Now, we will present the manifesto at the next elections. But, you know, we've just come through a general election. I think the SNP did rather well at it. And the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, outlined our position there, that there would have to be a material change of circumstances. It would be in a manifesto. It would be presented to the people of Scotland and then determined by another referendum to express that popular will.
Has anything materially changed then?
Well, at this point in time, no, I don't think the circumstances are presented to hold another referendum right now. I mean, I think the Conservative government is very unpopular, even more unpopular, the party that David Mundell represents in terms of austerity, not delivering on the vow and how they treat Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom for that matter. But we'll turn to the Scottish Parliament elections with a manifesto and the people can choose.
You see, but it's not... the lack of clarity, it seems to be something that's engaging some of your MPs as well. George Kerrivan, one of your new SNP MPs, said it's an issue that cannot be ignored. The best thing would be for the leadership to come forward with some proposals on how to deal with it.
Well, coming forward with proposals will be the Scottish Parliament elections manifesto, and that will determine our programme for the next term of the Scottish Parliament. And I know there's chat conference as well. I happen to chair party conference, and right now we're deciding what resolutions will be considered by the branches, and they will be presented to party conference.
Are they putting forward resolutions on this issue?
Well, I haven't seen them yet. I understand that there's over 100, and it's a committee elected by the party largely that determines what in the agenda for conference, and as usual I expect it to be a lively, dynamic and positive party conference which is fundamentally democratic.
But can you realistically imagine an SNP manifesto in 2016 that does not contain some kind of commitment on a referendum for independence?
Well, Gary, I'm not going to speculate what's going to be in the manifesto, but we'll certainly talk about independence because we still believe in it, and of course we think it's the right way to go, and that's the direction of travel. More powers and ultimately independence for Scotland. We haven't been dissuaded of that argument, and the unionist thought police can't point at us every time we say the words independence as if somehow our position's changed.
But, well, the difficulty is, in terms of your position, is that Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon repeated this as well last year, where they said the independence referendum was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Scots to grasp the thistle of independence. Was Alex Salmond espousing party policy at that point, or was that a personal view? Because some of your supporters online seem to be suggesting to me this morning that, that was just a personal view from Alex Salmond and we shouldn't be holding the SNP to account on that one.
Well, it's true to say it was a wonderful opportunity, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The people were asked the question. We don't know when the circumstances will present themselves again, but what we also know is that Westminster should not be let off the hook. Why should we say that Scotland can never have that democratic choice again or any time soon? So it's not the Unionists or even those in the SNP that get to determine when the referendum will be held. That's a matter for the people of Scotland through popular support.
So when senior members of your party last year said it was once in a generation, this opportunity, they didn't actually mean it.
Well, it was a once in a generation.
But you're talking about it potentially happening soon. How long is a generation in your book?
If circumstances dictate through the popular will of the people. As I say, we've just come through a Westminster election. Nicola Sturgeon made it perfectly clear through the course of that election when she was asked about it, what's your position on another referendum? And she explained it would have to have popular support, change in political circumstances, be in a manifesto and be supported through the expression of the people through a referendum. Now, I think people were comfortable with that position through the Westminster election, and I'm sure they'll be comfortable with whatever's presented to the next Scottish Parliament elections.
Why do you think your position didn't prevail last year? Why did you lose the referendum?
Well, I think that there was a great deal of scaremongering against the independence cause, frankly, and the negativity won the day on this occasion. But I still think that the argument for independence is sound, and I think that Scotland is perfectly capable of being an independent nation.
So there was nothing difficult in the proposition that you put forward to the public. I'm curious as to whether or not, if that happens again, you will put forward a different proposition.
Well, independence seems to work for many other countries around the world, so why not Scotland? And I think that we could fight a very good campaign, and I think that the direction of travel is towards more powers to the people of Scotland and ultimately Scotland running our own affairs. And I'm very confident about the argument, and I think that the SNP has been delivering good government. And I think the surge in support for the SNP just shows that people are energised and engaged like never before.
But you must be disappointed that that surge in support is not translated into a surge in support for independence at this stage.
Well, I know you're trying to make me depressed, but I can't be depressed with electoral success, historic election victories, a surge in party membership and a fantastic leader, Nicola Sturgeon. I'm afraid I'm far more upbeat than that, Gary.
OK, thank you very much for joining us. That's the ever-optimistic Derek Mackay there, chairman of the SNP. We're going to hear from the Shadow Scottish Secretary Ian Murray after 8:30. It's 8:16. Is a second independence referendum now inevitable? That's a key question this morning after a suggestion yesterday by the former First Minister Alex Salmond that a vote was indeed inevitable. But the UK government says it has no contingency plans for such a possibility. And the chairman of the SNP, Derek Mackay, told this programme there's currently no preparation or planning for a second independence vote. Well, joining us now from our Edinburgh studio is the Shadow Scottish Secretary, Ian Murray. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Given the SNP's current popularity, you can understand why Alex Salmond believes a second referendum is inevitable.
Well, everyone agreed back in September when the referendum happened that this would be a once-in-a-generational opportunity, in fact, even once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So to suggest that this may be in the SNP manifesto in just a few months' time, I think would be wrong. The Scottish people did say by 55% to 45% that they wanted to stay within the United Kingdom with a very strong Scottish Parliament, and I believe that's the way forward that we should be looking at.
But the point that Derek Mackay made earlier on this programme is that there are no plans at this stage from the SNP, the Scottish Government, to bring forward a proposal for an independence referendum. That's the end of the story, isn't it?
Well, I hope that that would be the case, and I hope it wouldn't appear in the manifesto. What he didn't commit to was saying that it wouldn't be in the 2016 Scottish Parliamentary Election Manifesto for the SNP, and I think George
But the
Kerrivan...
SNP supports independence. It wouldn't be a surprise if that was the case.
Well, given that everyone agreed, and Nicola Sturgeon agreed, that we shouldn't have another referendum in a generation, I think she should keep her promise on that. So therefore, if she's going to keep that promise, it would be strange for them to have that in a manifesto to say they'd deliver it over the next Scottish parliamentary period. And I think George Kerrivan in the Mail on Sunday yesterday was right when he said that we should be seeking clarity on this, because the First Minister, I think, has to clear this up.
But ultimately, one of the things that Mr Salmond is saying about the possibility of a referendum being brought forward is that the vow, as it's been called, this declaration before the referendum, was about home rule, Devo to the max, as he puts it, and he believes that's not what's been delivered in the Scotland Bill. Ultimately, do you regret those announcements from Gordon Brown pre-referendum?
Well, it's quite clear that the SNP are desperate to be disappointed with the Scotland Bill. The vow didn't say any of those particular things.
Gordon Brown did talk about it being near to federalism, didn't he?
Well, it's got to be near to federalism in a modern context, and what we've called for is a constitutional convention to look at the position of England, which is 85% of the UK, so that's a very, very large part. But what we've done with the Scotland Bill is very much engaged with it. I've placed over 80 amendments to the bill to try and make sure it's strengthened, to go further on welfare, to devolve housing benefit, and it's quite clear that the SNP are desperate to be disappointed with it. Not only to find an excuse for another referendum, but also to deflect from the big issues in public services in Scotland at the moment.
They're disappointed because it didn't live up to what Gordon Brown promised. Was it a hostage to fortune for Gordon Brown to make the pronouncements he made before the referendum, knowing, of course, that he was standing down from Parliament and would be in no position to deliver anyway?
Well, given the OECD have said that when the Scotland Bill's delivered, and if it's delivered with some of the amendments that I've put forward, it would make the Scottish Parliament one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world. I think there's a real opportunity for Scotland, and it would be really good if all parties actually engaged with that process, tried to make the Scotland Bill better, pressed the Secretary of State on his promises for making it better, and deliver that powerful parliament.
Well, the SNP would say, firstly, that they have the vast majority of MPs at Westminster from Scotland, and they did try to make the Scotland Bill better in their view by putting forward amendments, all of which were rejected.
Well, they put forward amendments for full fiscal autonomy, which were rightly rejected because of the devastating impact that would have had on Scottish finances and Scottish public services. But we've got a whole process to go through here. We're pressing on making sure that Scotland can design its own welfare system. That's something that the SNP and Labour agree on, and we'll press very hard for that over the next course of the progress of this bill. And just don't forget that this means that any single payslip that any worker gets who lives in Scotland in the next 18 months will have a Scottish rate of income tax. The entirety of income tax is coming across to Scotland, with the exceptions of some minor issues around savings. That's a huge opportunity for Scotland. We should engage with the Scotland Bill process and get as much out of it as we possibly can, and then take it forward to the next stage in the parliamentary process.
But you can only engage so far if Mr Mundell is not willing to accept the amendments that have been put forward. Do you understand why what has happened since the election perhaps fuels discontent with Westminster?
Well, actually, I agree with some of the processes around the Smith Agreement. We want to see the Smith Agreement absolutely delivered in full in both substance and spirit. But we said we'd want to go further on welfare. We've asked for housing benefit to be devolved. And in fact, my amendments to the bill have said that Scotland should be able to design its own welfare system. That's a fundamental difference from the Smith Agreement. So we've suggested we want the Smith Agreement done in full. All our amendments have been put forward to make sure the Smith Agreement is delivered in full, but also to go much further on welfare. That would mean the Scottish Parliament has all tax and all welfare powers. That's an incredibly big opportunity for Scotland, and we should grab it.
Can you give any guarantee to the electorate in Scotland that those measures that you want to see will actually happen?
Well, we're pressing very hard. The Secretary of State has said that he will look at some of the amendments that have come forward. It goes to the House of Lords, and the irony is, although it's the unelected chamber, it doesn't have a government majority at the moment, and therefore we might be able to win some of these amendments in the House of Lords. I want this Scotland Bill to leave the House of Commons after it has royal assent, to be sent to Scotland, and to make sure that it's the Smith Agreement in full in spirit and substance, but also going much further on welfare. And we have backing from a lot of third sector charities for that to happen.
But isn't that the very reason why many people are discontent with Westminster, that actually all but one of the Scottish MPs at Westminster back changes to the Scotland Bill, and the best you can hope for is the unelected House of Lords are able to make changes?
Well, that's not what I said. That's not the best that can be on offer. The Secretary of State has said he would come forward and accept some of our amendments. Well, let's see at the next stage in September what he comes forward with. Let's not be desperate to be disappointed with this bill until we've seen actually what happens with it. But all we're talking about at the moment is a process at Westminster on the Scotland Bill, a process in terms of trying to find a second referendum. And it seems to me there might be a little bit of deflection going on from some of the significant problems that Scotland has in public services at the moment, and the SNP Scottish Government are completely responsible for.
If there was to be another referendum, would Labour be part of a no campaign?
Well, that's a hypothetical question, isn't it? Because we've been told on a number of occasions that Nicola Sturgeon didn't want another referendum in a generation. She should keep that promise. It's a long, long way to go until we get to the end of that generation. I think she said to David Torrance that it would be at least 15 years. But
electorally, Labour have paid the price, haven't they, for being part of that campaign? So I presume it's something you'd want to steer clear of next time.
We paid the price for doing what we thought was the right thing. We are on the no side, and we made sure that was the case. I just wonder if you're posing hypothetical questions, if it was a yes vote back in the 18th September, whether or not the Scottish people would accept, given the collapse in the oil price and the devastation that would have had for Scottish public services, if we should have had another one very soon afterwards to take us back into the United Kingdom. So all these things are hypothetical. We very much said that it was best for Scotland to be in the United Kingdom with a strong Scottish Parliament. The Scotland Bill looks as if it's going to deliver that strong Scottish Parliament with the amendments that we've put forward if they're accepted, and we should be grabbing that with both hands, giving the Scottish Parliament the powers to be one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world, and doing what we should be doing, which is talking about public services and trying to deliver for the people of Scotland.
Shadow Scottish Secretary Ian Murray, thank you very much for that. It's 17 minutes to 9. OK, Graham, it's 7 minutes to 9. Back to our main news this morning. Alex Salmond talking about the inevitability of a second independence referendum. On the programme, we've heard from the Scottish Secretary, who asked the SNP for clarity on the issue, while the SNP's chairman responded by saying there were no plans for another vote. Well, Alex Bell is a former Chief Policy Advisor to Alex Salmond and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Gary.
What do you make of Mr Salmond's comments?
I think he's doing what is absolutely necessary for the SNP, which is to keep the idea of the referendum alive. But I think, as this morning's coverage in your interview with Derek Mackay shows, we get to the very heart of the dilemma for the SNP, which is namely they're an independence party that isn't arguing for independence. Indeed, they're an independence party that isn't even planning for independence at the moment, according to Derek Mackay. And that gives them a problem, namely, well, why bother voting for an independence party if they're not going to deliver independence? Therefore, to get over that hump, they have to keep stirring up the news about, well, we might have a referendum soon. Oh, yes, England's been betraying us. Oh, no, things aren't going quite to plan. And that keeps the momentum going, and it keeps the focus of other areas of policy.
And how much of this is about the electorate and how much of it is about internal SNP machinations, given that they have now increased representation at Westminster and we have some MPs who are very keen to keep this on the agenda?
Well, it's a huge amount. One of the phrases we should get rid of is that the Scottish people will decide when the next referendum happens. That's not what the SNP wants. What the SNP wants is they will decide when there is another referendum. For that to happen, they have to stay in power. For them to stay in power, they have to keep up the story that things could happen at any moment and that they're being betrayed at any moment. And so what you have is this rhetoric allows for those people who've joined the party thinking that it's independence and nothing less to still be on board, whilst inevitably, and I will put money on this, the 2016 manifesto will not have a clear-cut pledge to another referendum within the term of that Parliament. There will be some kind of fudge, which, a bit like Gordon Brown's fudge over joining the euro, there will be a series of tests which will never quite be met. And that suits the SNP down to the ground. They stay in power, they stay in control, but they also keep those enthusiasts on board.
But they believe they've got a wider point here, which is the Conservatives pursuing the issue of Europe and also pursuing further austerity, which they believe both are issues that the Scottish public are more likely to side with the SNP on.
Well, indeed, but that's where you come to this core problem. Derek Mackay has admitted that they're doing no planning for another referendum, by which I take to mean they're doing no review of their case for independence. And I'm not surprised, because the SNP's case for independence is looking weaker by the day. Once post-Greece, post the borrowing crash, post-austerity, it's very hard for the SNP to make their ultimately positive case about Scotland and go into detail about that. The classic irony we have at the moment, Gary, is the Mary Black speech. Beautiful, wonderful, I could sign up to the whole thing. But the dilemma for the SNP is, how on earth do you deliver Mary Black's vision? And that's something they don't want to get into.
Alex Bell, former Chief Policy Advisor to Alex Salmond, thank you very much for that. 4 minutes tonight.